Late at night, in the small town of Ravenwood, a chilling presence lurked in the darkness. The town was old, filled with tales of ghosts and spirits, but no one truly believed them except for one girl, Elara. She had been experiencing something unexplainable, something that kept her awake every night, staring at the ceiling, dreading the moment her eyes would close. It all began a month ago, when she first woke up in the middle of the night, feeling an odd sensation. Her body was paralyzed, unable to move, but her mind was completely awake. As she struggled to scream, she felt an invisible force pulling her upwards. Her breath hitched as she realized she was floating, no longer inside her own body. Looking down, she saw herself lying still on the bed. Panic took over, but she couldn't move back. She hovered in the air, weightless, trapped in a state she could not understand. The first time it happened, she convinced herself it was a dream, but when it happened again and then again, she knew something was terribly wrong. Each night, the experience grew more intense. She would find herself standing at the edge of her bed, staring at her own lifeless body. But what terrified her the most was not the separation, it was the shadow that watched her from the corner of her room. At first, it was just a flicker, something she assumed was a trick of her mind. But soon, it became clear. A dark figure, tall and unmoving, always present, always watching. Elara tried to tell her mother, but the response was dismissive. "Just nightmares," she had said, ruffling her daughter's hair. But Elara knew better. This wasn't a nightmare, it was real. And every night, the shadow got closer. One night, curiosity overtook her fear. Instead of panicking, she tried to control her floating state. She willed herself to move, testing the limits of her strange condition. To her shock, she glided toward the window, able to pass through the glass like a ghost. Outside, the town was eerily quiet, the streetlights flickering. But when she turned back toward her house, she saw the shadow figure standing right beside her bed, looking down at her body. Terror gripped her soul. It had never moved before. It had always just watched. But now, it was closer than ever, reaching out with a hand made of darkness. Desperately, she willed herself back, pushing toward her own body. It was harder than before, like fighting against an invisible force, but she finally crashed back inside herself. She woke up gasping, sweat soaking her sheets. But the shadow was gone. Days passed, and the sleepless nights took their toll. Dark circles framed her eyes, her skin turned pale, and she barely spoke. Her friends noticed the change, but she couldn't tell them the truth. How could she? No one would believe her. Then came the worst night of all. That evening, as the clock struck midnight, Elara felt herself drifting once more, but this time something was different. She wasn't just floating, she was being pulled. An invisible force dragged her away from her body, out of her room, down the hallway, until she was outside, hovering above the ground. The air was cold, her breath visible in the eerie moonlight. She tried to fight it, to move back toward her house, but she was powerless. And then she saw it. The shadow was there, waiting for her. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It had eyes glowing, filled with an unimaginable hunger, and it spoke. "You don't belong here," it whispered, the voice like 1,000 echoes overlapping. Elara wanted to scream, but no sound came. The shadow reached for her, its fingers curling around her translucent form, and she felt an icy grip sink into her very soul. Pain exploded in her chest, and for the first time, she feared she would never return. She fought with everything she had, thinking only of her body, of her home, of her life. With a final, desperate push, she forced herself backward. The force resisted, but she didn't stop. She thought of her mother, her friends, the life she wasn't ready to lose. And suddenly, she was free. She jolted awake, her body drenched in sweat, heart racing. But something was wrong. The room felt off, the air heavier. Slowly, she turned her head and froze. The shadow was still there, not in the corner, not watching. From afar, it was standing right beside her bed. A twisted grin formed where its mouth should have been. And in that moment, she understood it wasn't just watching anymore. It had followed her back.